Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm 31, so we're all good. Are we all good on the live stream? Great, fantastic. Good afternoon, welcome to this panel event, kindly hosted for us by the CPS and CapEx today. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel, for joining me today, making my job, making energy fun, so much more interesting and easier for me. My name is Natasha Clark, I'm LBC's political editor. I work across all of Global's fantastic brands, you know and love, from Capital, LBC to Heart, Classic and Smooth Radio. So I'm really pleased to be hosting this panel with you guys today. Emma and the team at CPS know there is not much that gets me to do a panel event at Party Conference, because I am constantly running around trying to please everybody from Nick Ferrari to James O'Brien to Andrew Marr to Ian Dale, and upset as many Tory press officers as possible, this time by pointing out spelling mistakes on their bars of chocolate. So sorry, guys, about that. Anyway, I am going to make an exception. I'm going to make an exception today to talk about an issue that does really matter to me, and it matters to LBC listeners as well. Of course, it's energy. Why are Britain's energy costs so high? How can we get them down to reduce pressure on households is what we'll be talking about for the next hour or so. And I do have a little bit of experience in this matter. I was reporting on energy when I was at the Sun newspaper. This was always one of the things I kept on coming back to. Boilers and bills. It's obviously electric cars, of course, fell into that remit, but things that really matter to people, issues of policy that really affect people's lives, and how we in the media can be relevant to them, and how you as a political party and as politicians, as policymakers, can also be relevant to these crucial issues that really matter to people and affect their lives. And as the Conservatives try to stay relevant, should I say, during this particularly tricky time, that is one thing that I'm very glad to see the party focus on at this conference. Britain has some of the highest power prices in the developed world. Of course, the government still... sorry. I think it's fallen off. Sorry. Can I have a help here? Sorry.
Just shout.
Yeah, I can. Sorry, how's yours split on?
There's a bit of magnet on the back.
Okay, try again. Is it there? Okay.
There you go.
I'll try not to gesticulate too much more. Is that all right? Yeah. Sorry about that. Obviously, this newish Labour government wants to go greener. They're trying to get there by 2030. There's been some crucial decisions already taken by this Labour government. Onshore wind springs to mind, of course. We've got more very difficult decisions for this government to come. Oil and gas in the North Sea, for one. Those new licences, where they're going to go on that. We've already had quite a big discussion, of course, about zonal pricing, grid capacity, planning, and replacing boilers in electric cars feels like it's maybe gone down the agenda a little bit, but I'm sure that will pop up again. I really want to know your thoughts today, so we will be kicking off this panel by hearing from everyone here, but I really want to know your thoughts on where this sector goes next, and how the Conservative Party and of course you can help shape that conversation. I also want to hear more about how you think that Claire Coutinho, the Shadow Energy Secretary, and her thoughts, and how that shaped this conference so far, and their plans. Do you think that Kemi Badenoch's step away slightly from net zero by 2050 is the right one? How can the Conservatives make the case for clean power? What is the role of the state? What is the role of those subsidies that we know are a really important part of the sector? Of course, how can we bring down our bills? And of course, we must touch too on other systems around the world. What are other countries doing that we're not? What can we learn from them? And of course, we can't get into this discussion really by talking about how prices have been affected by global headwinds, the war in Ukraine too. So a huge topic as well as we go into the winter, especially as Ed Miliband, as the Labour government, promised to bring down the bills during the election. That's obviously not happened yet. We've seen the energy price cap so far take them up. We've seen the keynote speech yesterday from Claire Coutinho talking about cutting some of the levies. I want to know from you, do you think that plan's going to work? Is that the right way to go? So we'll kick off with the opening questions. Then I'll widen it out to you guys at the floor with a Q&A, and we will be wrapping up promptly at 1:30, so you can all grab some lunch. You can get involved with us here at the CPS and CapEx on social media at CPS Think Tank and at CapEx on X, Instagram and LinkedIn. And please stick around and say hello to our lovely panel afterwards. So I am really delighted that we do have such a great panel for you all today. Ben Houchen joins me here, Metro Mayor of the Tees Valley. I'll do a very quick wrap of the speakers. Ben qualified as a solicitor in 2009, practicing corporate law, commercial law. He was UK and European CEO of an international sportswear company. What was that?
BLK.
BLK, very good. He was also leader of the... He's a little bit niche, yeah. Talk about a change in political direction there. He was also the leader of the Conservative group on Stockton Borough Council, elected as the first mayor of Tees Valley in 2017, re-elected in 2021 and 2024. We've also got Jack Richardson, head of policy for Octopus Energy. James is the former government special advisor, former head of energy and climate at Onward think tank as well. We've also got Dylan as well, the head of energy and environment here at the CPS. He's written extensively on energy, transport and net zero, has a background in finance, having worked previously in debt capital markets at Deutsche Bank in London and New York. And finally, we have Dara Vyas. She joins us as the CEO of Energy UK, where she joined us there in November 2022. She's an expert in energy consumer issues and the energy transition. Prior to that, she led work on net zero, decarbonisation and the future energy system at Citizens Advice. She's also on the board of Green Lights. So thank you all so much. I will get right into the action. Let's start with that main sort of discussion that we've sort of put on the as we say on the tin. What are the main drivers keeping Britain's energy costs high? Dara, would you be able to kick us off?
Yeah, I'll do my best, and thank you for the introduction and for having me. I think I'm going to try and bookend my remarks with a kind of note on investors. I've been talking about bills and affordability for a long time, but in the last sort of 18, 20 months, the conversation has not been just with energy suppliers and those involved in supporting customers, households and businesses. That conversation now happens when you talk to investors, when you talk to pension funds, when you talk to investment banks, when you talk to developers, operators in the system. So the first thing and the most important thing I think to recognise is that concern about bills and affordability is a cross-energy industry. It is no longer just the preserve of the energy suppliers who are involved in the billing and debt management. And that's really important to note, because the reality is investment in the system is necessary. Whichever path you choose, whether you go for nuclear, renewables, hydrogen, carbon capture, investment is crucial. So that's why I think that's really important to note. We have an issue because we have got a growing debt problem when it comes to households. We've got, I think, 4.7 billion pounds of debt on the official books. It's probably a lot higher than that. I'm sure Jack can talk about that. Debt is a significant concern across households. Businesses continue to struggle with the price of energy. You touched on it already. The policy costs that are on an average pub bill is around £2,700, right? That's just the policy cost. And the reason that matters is because that's often how we're paying for so much of this. We're moving from a sort of space where it was the wholesale price of gas that was really driving costs when it comes to our bills. We're now, I think, having to consider very carefully what the impact of policy costs is having on bills. That's important because I think it's too easy to say, oh, it's CFDs that are driving up bills. It's not just CFDs. We've had an expansion of warm home discount. We've got new levies, the nuclear RAB, the hydrogen levy. They're all coming onto bills. We've got possibly the business industrial decarbonisation scheme might be coming onto bills as well. And these are all piled onto electricity. And if we're going to electrify rapidly, and the Shadow Secretary of State talked about, one of her sort of 3 or 4 pillars is very much around affordable energy, we need to think very carefully about how are we paying for this investment across the energy system, whether it's network charges because we're building out grid. We haven't really invested in grid the way we ought to have in the last decade. It does need to happen. We've got a creaking infrastructure. Those costs have to be paid for somehow. I think the challenge is how do you fairly pay for them? How are you thinking about who's paying and when? And how you distribute that. What's the distribution effect? So it's too easy, I think, to have the conversation where you say, well, it should be on taxpayers, not bill payers. There's a whole load of sensitivity within that. And my point, and returning back to investors, is investors do need certainty in order to put money into this country. And I think the challenge to the traditional party of business is how are you going to give investors certainty as you look at the UK as a proposition when we're in a global race for these sorts of capital amounts.
Thanks, Dara. Dylan, would you just be able to sort of take us through what you think are the main drivers? Is it just subsidies? Is Britain in outlier among other international countries on where we are on energy costs.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I'll first say there are plenty of seats in the front if you people standing in the back want to come up. So we are in a crisis. This is bad for the second year in a row. We have amongst the highest energy costs in the developed world. Businesses up and down the country are struggling. Energy-intensive businesses closing at a sort of disastrous rate, and yeah, for many households, this is simply unaffordable. It feels a bit strange to be at a Conservative Party conference bemoaning that we have such high bills when, of course, it was Conservatives who have been in power for the last 14 years. I think a lot of owning up to that is quite important. There has not been as much of a focus on costs as there needs to be. A lot of things were piled onto bills, right? And I think the government took a particular approach on that in part, things like renewable energy, you can see the logic for funding them on bills, at least initially, but also in part, secretly, if you want to fund any other subsidy scheme, you have to go begging to the Treasury for money. On bills, just whack it on, and there's nowhere near the same level of scrutiny on what goes onto bills as there is for taxation. And I think that absolutely has come back to bite us. So I think the overarching message, we should be radical and we should be sort of prepared to think differently than we have in the past. I think my number one near-term policy to cut bills is to sack Ed Miliband. Clean Power 2030 is disastrous and will be, the basic policy is we want to buy the entire pipeline of renewable auctions, which will likely involve paying higher prices for those renewables, not for 15 years, for 20 years, and laying that all onto bills, all for this sort of manic belief that gas is bad, and we must get off gas. And what's funny is if you look at most price forecasts for the next few years, gas prices are expected to fall. So we'll be getting off gas just as gas is becoming cheap. Great, thanks, Ed. But I suppose I also want to get onto something else, which is a sort of legacy of the last 14 years and how we built a lot of generation in this country, which has been subsidies, right? It was initially as a renewables obligation subsidy, which Claire, I think you rightly mentioned yesterday, we do need to look at exactly how you do that. I will sort of keen to sort through, but these are costing bill payers. But then secondly, the CFD, and I think for us as Conservatives, one of the sort of challenges with renewable deployment and one of the critiques has been these things are entirely subsidy driven. You saw Richard Tice saying if reform comes into government, they're going to cancel all the subsidy contracts. I think in some people's mind, renewables are this fake industry that is only underpinned by subsidies, and if only we rip away the subsidies, poof, the whole industry will disappear. And to shamelessly plug a forthcoming CPS Energy report, that is emphatically not the case. There is in fact a thriving private market for renewables in this country in the form of power purchase agreements, which is quite simply any company and many of sort of household names, Tesco, Amazon, Sky News, essentially say, Tesco will pay to help a new solar farm stand up for the next 10 years. And in that way, you're helping new energy generations get stood up without having to go forward the bill payer for subsidies. And it's funny, having done quite a bit of research on this, sort of talking to a lot of these corporates, why are you doing this? It must just be ESG. Actually, no. Mostly the answer is I want to be able to hedge my electricity costs for the next 10 years, and this is the best way that I can do that. Which is quite exciting, particularly because actually it's not just renewables. Nuclear, one of the things, one of the great things about the new SMR revolution that we're all so excited about, in part, is that they are repeatable, you can build them in a factory, benefit from economies of scale, but also in part, they're a fair bit smaller than your traditional huge Hinkley Point C, Sizewell C reactors, which means they can be privately financed. At some point in the future. And it's funny, when I started writing this report, I imagined in 10 years, once the first of a kind things have deployed, then maybe we'll get to a private model. In fact, it's already starting today. In Ben's patch, there's a very exciting company called Community Nuclear that I encourage you all to go have a look at, that want to build SMRs privately with no state subsidy, which is very exciting. And so I suppose my ending pitch would be, if you want cheap power, I think as a CPS person I would say, let's put the market back in power market, and hopefully have the market deciding what generation is cheapest and how it gets built, rather than Ed Miliband handpicking exactly which projects should get subsidies.
Thank you, Dylan. Ben, would you like to sack Ed Miliband?
Yes.
Wouldn't expect you to say anything less.
Yeah, but again, there have been, as has been pointed out, there have been failures for a number of years over this policy. I mean, the thing that driving energy costs, I won't go over the previous ones, but investment is a major issue. You know, the number of investors I speak to who are already investing in the UK, who are pulling out of the UK because of energy pricing, creates an environment in which investors increasingly look at the UK as a second-tier economy. And so that makes it more difficult to attract the capital that could support the development of some of these technologies.
And do you find that's because of subsidies or other issues?
It's
to
to do with energy pricing.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think the numbers were just produced the other day, and I think the industrial energy price just topped out at 25 pence a kilowatt hour. On average, you know, if you go to places in the Middle East, if you go to some places in the US, that's as low as 5 pence a kilowatt hour. Sometimes even lower than that, actually, where they're doing direct PPA agreements with power generators to plug a power station of some form or energy generation of some form directly into the offtake, the process. You cannot compete as a nation if you look at things like chemicals, processing, energy-intensive industries, data centers, manufacturing. You can't do any of that in an environment where the industrial price is hitting now 25 pence a kilowatt hour and looks set to increase because of the wider levies, taxation and subsidy issues that come. So investment is a problem because it starts to become a bit of a doom loop as investors start to leave. Obviously, new investors, the first question they ask us every time is energy pricing, and it's a big hurdle to be able to get over. So not having that new investment doesn't drive more generation, doesn't drive more of the direct relationships, which again keeps the energy pricing high. You want an abundance of energy. I think the second issue beyond investment is just general policy. And again, speakers already have touched upon this, but for me, and I've said this for years at conference and to many ministers, the biggest problem we have as a country is we are not agnostic enough about power generation. We try and pick winners and losers. Previously, it's been solar and offshore wind. Now it's onshore wind. You know, hydrogen's still floating around as to whether that will or won't work. You know, it could do. And the interesting thing that I take the position on, I forget the gentleman's name now, the Energy Secretary in the US. I found myself, for some unbeknown reason, watching his confirmation hearing after the election. And I think he made a really interesting point that I would completely agree with, was it's not about being pro-anti-renewables, it's just being about pro-energy. And the right energy source in the right place for the right use. That could be solar, it could be onshore wind, it doesn't matter. It's about not being picky about it. And the whole of the future economy, not just in the UK, but the global economy, is about power. Who's going to be able to generate an abundance of power to increase living standards, create economic growth? And at the moment, that battle is between the US and China. Europe is stagnating, the UK is definitely stagnating on it. And so there's a huge issue there around policy of being more agnostic. And it really goes back to a point, you know, I don't know when it was, somewhere between 2012 and 2015, where we decided that we were going all out for electrification. You know, electrification is a plan, but electrification isn't necessarily the right thing in a place like Teesside, where you've got a chemical cluster where gas or LNG or polyethylene or hydrogen could be the solution. It doesn't have to be electrification. But at the moment, national policy is everything's about electrification. And so we have a very Sir Humphreys thing going on at the moment, where every decision is to reinforce a decision that was taken more than 10 years ago. And sometimes when the facts change, you wish that the civil service would change the advice it gives. And you ultimately have a problem at the moment with Ed Miliband, who is obviously a zealot on net zero. And you can agree with that or not, but I think he probably sees himself as this being his last big job in politics. I think he does believe in it, and he's been working on this a lot in opposition, and this is a legacy issue for him as well. So he's going at it hell for leather because he believes, rightly or wrongly, that it's the right thing to do, and that's causing frictions within government as well. So we've got a huge policy issue. I won't go on for too much longer, but the other things, regulatory issues. So you can't have cheap energy without building the new infrastructure. You need cables in the ground, you need pylons, you need substations. The current regulations, albeit there are some reforms being touted, but it looks quite vague to me at the moment, but the reform is needed regulatory-wise from Ofgem to be able to invest it ahead of demand. You know, it looks like it's coming, but for the last however many years, Ofgem were not allowed to give permission to National Grid to build new substations, knowing that demand's coming down the line in a number of years' time. So let's get ahead of the problem. You can't do it until the demand is there. Now, again, that puts us years behind because, again, beyond regulation, you've got planning issues. You know, if you want to build a new substation or put pylons up, you've got to go through a DCO. Well, there's no chance you hit in 2030. It's going to take you 3 or 4 years. If you're lucky to go through a single DCO, never mind rewiring the whole country. So 2030 is dead. So you've basically just killed the UK by running at something that it's impossible to reach in 2030. So all of these things come together, and many, many more. But I think, you know, without going on for too long, those are the primary issues that we have. And it feels to me like, even with Ed Miliband, who's running at kind of some of the renewable stuff, there's a real lack of understanding within central government about the operationalisation of how you go through a transition, and particularly at the pace they're talking about doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, the physical nuts and bolts of having men and women on the ground building physical infrastructure to support this, separate from the generation or the demand assets, just seems to go over government officials' heads, and therefore the advice that's going up to ministers who are not particularly educated in this themselves is making decisions that are physically impossible. And I think we saw that with the NESO report for the 2030 target that came out, which is basically nobbled by politicians, because actually had it been written objectively, and it's come out now that, you know, politicians influenced the writing of what was supposed to be an independent report, it was going to say that 2030 was impossible. So government policy has nobbled an independent report to try and hit 2030 that everybody knows is impossible. And who's left holding the baby in the bathwater? It's the consumer, with higher prices, deindustrialisation, the loss of jobs in industries, which opens us up to a global market which is increasingly fractured, which has an impact on national security. I mean, the future is not an optimistic one.
Jack, is 2030, clean power by 2030 possible?
So we mostly focused on the demand side. As Ben said, we just want electricity to be cheap. And going back to the exam question, there's 5 ways to make it cheaper, or 5 things that are going wrong. I've written them down there: risk, prices, taxes, regs, and redistribution. I'll start with risk. So this is going to be very controversial to say in the CPS tent, but Maggie Thatcher got it wrong. In 1968,
We can take him off stage.
in 1968, there was a parliamentary debate where she actually very persuasively argued against tapping our North Sea gas and chucking that into our homes. Following that, there was a nationalised sector effort. Basically, over 10 years, 40 million appliances, gas boilers and stuff. My granddad actually installed them in the West Midlands. Over 10 years, at today's money's cost of about £8 billion, 40 million appliances. But the main argument she made was against stranded assets. She said, well, we've just installed all this coal gas stuff, super new and shiny. We don't want to be wasting all that money. To be fair to Maggie, actually, I was only trying to be controversial, but to be fair to Maggie, the context is different in the nationalised context. But in the privatised system that we have now, we still basically remove as much risk as we can. I know you have to balance it with investor certainty and everything, but removing risk from generators, developers, comes at a cost to the bill payer. So there's some recent ones, there's the cost of Sizewell B and Sizewell C, sorry, and the regulated asset-based model. There's also, we spent £1 billion so far this year switching off wind turbines when it's windy, rather than making the companies cut their electricity prices for local bill players. And then we often pay the same companies a load of cash extra to fire up their gas plants instead, and those costs are going to go up to £8 billion plus by 2029. And then there's general price fixing, not just for onshore and offshore wind and solar, but storage as well. And there's now lots and lots of chats about basically nationalising the gas fleet. And that brings me on to the second one, prices. I couldn't resist bringing this one up because of Octopus, but we just fought a campaign for a long time. We had the system operator, Ofgem CEO, the consumer groups, Tech UK, and a bunch of other organisations arguing with us to introduce more prices into the electricity market to basically drive efficiency and lower costs everywhere. We've decided to stick to the system where we all pay the highest price possible at any given time, basically in the name of investor certainty, but that does mean that our electricity bills are about to, well, continue going up. So more prices following the rest of the developed, the majority of developed economies by bringing in locational signals into the market would help to drive efficiency throughout the system as well. The taxes, we've gone over this, I think there's like 18 to 20 billion pounds. I think Catherine Porter just walked through the door, she did a report on this, on energy production and consumption, trying to electrify, but we're only doing a carbon tax on electricity, but not on gas. and it's all hitting the consumer at the end of the day. And it's weird. We do subsidise heat pumps, but then we tax them 4 to 5 times more than a gas boiler, wiping out the efficiency gains for a lot of people. If it weren't for those taxes, then the heat pumps that we install, we can cut a heating bill by £600. So yeah, we need to definitely reform the taxes. That's actually quite difficult because it's a kind of weird mushroomy system of dodgy levies that have sprouted up, and we've now got Wetherspoons subsidising steel plants and homes having to basically pay for redistributive policies to other homes to support them with their bills. And then there's regulation. I mean, this depends on which bit we're talking about. Sometimes it's bad regulation, sometimes it's a lack of regulation, sometimes it's too much regulation. So, for instance, there's no regulation stopping gas boiler installers from whacking in a gas boiler with a really high flow rate, basically making that gas boiler run as inefficiently as possible, so you burn as much gas as possible and therefore have to pay the supplier lots. So you still got, I don't know if you remember in 2022, there was that big campaign to turn your
boiler down. Yeah.
We still
We all
have
did it.
gases, we still have gas boilers being installed with a 90% flow rate now. But on the other hand, still we've had some regulations go, but you still have to do planning permission for like a third of heat pumps because they make a bit of noise, and the person will have to pay £1,000 or so to get a certificate saying that it doesn't make too much noise to pass their planning permission. And then there's also really bad regulation upstream. So yeah, we need to invest in the grid, but I think I wrote down this stat that a friend of me gave. So between 2008 and 2021, for every £100 given to the network operators, they only invested £73 to £81. So the incentive from the regulatory regime is to underinvest, because basically they get to take a bit of that money back and hand it over to their investors as profits, which the end result is basically your bills go up to usually pay foreign capital firms a bit of money, and then we end up with an underinvested grid, and then we turn around a few years later and go, oh gosh, we need to invest in the grid, we haven't done enough investment. So we've got bills going up to pay for nothing in some cases. And then finally, I mean, I've already touched on it before, but there was a good piece in the Sunday Times, actually a very worrying piece from the hospitality sector saying our standing charges are about to go up massively to subsidise other bits of the economy. That's happening across the bill stack now. Residential homes are now having to have their electricity bills go up to subsidise steel plants. Don't get me wrong, the steel plants, they need help. We really cannot afford to lose any more of our industry. But Octopus's view is, rather than constantly raising bills to hand it out to different parts of the economy, we just need to focus full square on cutting the cost of energy.
Thanks, Jack. And full disclosure, I do still have a big octopus in my spare bedroom. Thanks very much for letting me come around and look at your factory. It was really good to see what a heat pump actually is and what it looks like, because I think so many of us just don't really know. Yeah, we're obviously facing a really challenging environment. Dara, what did you think of the plan from the Shadow Energy Secretary yesterday, specifically speaking about subsidies, what she thinks can be done? Obviously, you know, we've heard from the government repeatedly that they are going to cut their bills. Is the Shadow Energy Secretary's plan going to cut bills? Should the government look at cutting some of those levies?
I don't think repealing the Climate Change Act is the answer to this. I think that it has, the conversation in that space has been very much around replacing it. So I think the plans for an energy strategy will be really important. And the reason I say that is because enduring legislation like the Climate Change Act really does give a sense of continuity, and it gives investors confidence. So I don't think that would have any direct impact on reducing bills at all. I think what you've heard from this panel reflects the complexity of the energy market, actually. You know, all of the different angles, from what Ben said to Jack to Dylan, you know, those are all really important. And for me, what I heard the Shadow Energy Secretary say yesterday was really compelling on bringing down bills, but I'm not sure there's enough detail on how you do it, because if you do want to go big on nuclear, that's still going to cost quite a lot of money. And I think, to Ben's point about the kind of the mix of energy you need, you absolutely do need to keep investing in carbon capture and hydrogen and nuclear and gas. Like, I represent the thermal gas generators as well. There will be gas on the system post 2030 and well into the 2030s. I think, actually, you know, if you were to ask me where the focus should be, I think it's very much about how do we get to the cleanest possible energy system at the lowest possible cost. It would be a mistake for us collectively as a society to be too relaxed about the forward curve on gas looking like it's coming down. I hope it does come down. I hope it does lead to lower bills. But that's the point at which you do invest, because we are still dependent on importing a fossil fuel, which a price that's set internationally. And the former government spent £40 billion supporting households and businesses during that time. It was the right thing to do. But you can't afford to do that again. No government can afford to do that again. It was an awful lot of money. So I think to sum it up, look, we still need to invest in clean power. Perhaps we need to have an honest conversation about how we do that. And we have an honest conversation about how do we get to the cleanest system possible at the lowest cost. There's just one thing I'd add, which is I think Jack's point about demand is crucial. You know, we have to drive up demand for electrification if we want to justify any of this.
Can I just do a quick straw poll? Obviously, you know, we're not just talking about net zero here, we're talking about energy more widely. Who still agrees with Theresa May's policy to bring forward that net zero 2050 target? Can I have a show of hands for people who still agree with that policy here? Okay. And who agree that it needs to be done quicker? Who agrees that clean power by 2030 we should be pushing for that? Okay. Interesting. Okay, well, I'd like to open up to the floor in a few minutes. Dylan, what do you think we should learn from other countries about which countries are doing this right in terms of net zero 2030? But also, obviously, if Britain has one of the highest energy costs in what are other countries doing that we're not?
Perhaps I'm going to give a somewhat predictable answer, as you can probably tell the gentle American accent. But a good friend of mine said Britain should try to be more like Texas, and I could not agree more. Not just for the lovely hat, but for their energy policy, which is yes and all of the above. Not only is Texas a huge oil and gas state, they are a huge renewable state. It is their energy market, how they structured it, is one of the most free market systems in the world. I mean, it's funny. Everybody thinks of, you know, blue states like California as being huge for renewables and battery deployment. Actually, Texas is blazing ahead with tons of cheap solar and cheap wind and tons of gas to back it up. I think that sort of they've done well the abundance mentality, whereas I think for so much of UK policy has been, you know, scarcity is a bit of a dirty word, but it has been sort of. I think that abundance mindset has not been as forward in UK policy as it should be. And indeed, I actually want to pick up on something Jack was talking about in one of his points on sort of guaranteeing returns and what comes with that. He's too modest to mention, but one of his colleagues has coined a phrase which I rather like, which is, if you all remember, the old CEGP Central Electricity Generating Board, which was how the government decided sort of how power was going to be allocated and who would get it, which the phrase is coined has been replaced by the Central Returns Generating Board. So the point of government policy has been to generate returns for all of these investors, which, you know, on the one hand, if you've got to build a ton of generation right now, super quick, then of course everybody's going to say, well, then you need to, you know, guarantee my returns for the next 10 or 15 years. You know, which you can understand why those decisions were taken at the time. But the flip side of that is, who guarantees those returns? All of us. And sort of socializing all of that rather than making generators and everybody in the system who's best placed to actually manage that risk responsible for their own returns, I think is one of the big issues that the UK faces that many other countries have been a bit bolder about.
Is it about also the idea that we have that single energy market in the UK? Would you say that is one of the problems, that America obviously doesn't have the same type of market that we do, and is that really the cause of all these problems?
Yeah, so subtle plug for locational pricing. Indeed, Texas, as keen audience members may know, is one of the homes of an even more intense form of locational pricing, where it's sort of very, very discrete. Rather than just dividing up the generation into zones, you're dividing it up into tons of little nodes. And again, you're driving price efficiency, you are driving the right generation decisions in terms of not just where generators should sit themselves, but also should they dispatch, how can the grid handle their power or not. It's a much more efficient system in that way. But even if you don't want to go full on, it's called nodal pricing. Plenty of systems in Europe and around the world have the zonal pricing model. And indeed, I think that's probably, at least up until now, the biggest casualty of Clean Power 2030. Obviously, Red Ed was not going to risk the 2030 mission by going for zonal pricing, and yet it makes me want to pull my hair out that zonal pricing could genuinely bring down bills, and Ed Miliband has chosen another path.
Ben, do you agree with that assessment? And how do you think the Conservatives can shape that discussion, whether that be around prices, zonal energy, what Ed Miliband's not doing to help bring down bills?
And I think what Claire was saying about the net zero policy for 2050, I think it's also more cultural within an organisation. It's like cultural change. Once you set that type of target, a system, being Whitehall, reconfigures itself and integrates that as a target. So, two more abstract examples, but I think it's useful to understand why you don't necessarily need to move away from transition and decarbonisation. You do it in a more efficient way where you go for energy abundance and the right things in the right place. And actually, zonal pricing is a really interesting argument. It gets distilled into the press as kind of like a postcode lottery on pricing. But actually, the way that it needs to be pitched is, okay, some people are paying more for energy, but they'll be paying less than they're paying now. So all prices will come down. Some will come down more than others. And actually, I would make an argument that they'd end up disproportionately benefiting areas like mine, red wall areas, in the bottom quarter percentile from a poverty basis across the UK. So there's also a real kind of powerful poverty levelling up argument to make on it. On net zero, the two perverse things I would talk about, where this was never intended by a 2050 target. I think the LEV mandate.
Why do you say that?
Well, because I think if you look at, for example, the Z mandate on cars, where now because of the 2050 target, policy has been developed where car manufacturers are being penalised for not selling enough electric vehicles, and it works out at something like 15,000 to 20,000 pounds a car under the target. A car manufacturer gets penalised. That means we are going to lose mass car manufacturing in this country over the coming years. JLR, Nissan, Toyota's already on the edge, if not already gone. These are all going to go, and it's not only important for the car manufacturing industry. As they've already sent up the flare, they're saying if we don't have this stuff, if there was, God forbid, ever a war, these are manufacturers, and they have the ability to turn towards a war effort that we're also exposing ourselves to. A really niche one we're dealing with in the northeast at the minute is we're trying to build what will be the UK centre for AI data centres in the country, delivering AI sovereign capability. AI data centres need water. Actually, they're not as water intensive as some people think, and a lot of it's more closed loop. But, the northeast is the one place in the country that has huge amounts of water. If the northeast runs out of water, we've got bigger problems in the world. So it's not an issue of who's getting less water and cost of water, etc. We have a huge reservoir in the northeast, and the infrastructure exists from the 1980s. It was built and kind of completed in the early 90s. And actually, over time, we use less of that water because of deindustrialization with the chemicals and the steelworks going offline. So all of the infrastructure exists, and we've been working with government, we've been working with the regulators and Northumbria Water, and we're trying to get that turned back on. No new infrastructure, no new building. It's been used before until about 2015 when the steelworks closed. So it was in use in the last 10 years. We just want to put water in the pipelines that can take it and already exists. There needs to be a completely new environmental impact assessment on that, because the Environment Agency says circumstances might have changed over the last 10 years and we might not want you to use this massive water infrastructure that we approved back in the late 80s. We might not want you to use that anymore, but it's going to take you about 3 years to get an answer if we decide to give you an answer. And what's even more bizarre about it, there's something called the National Eel Board. And the National Eel Board must be consulted on new reservoirs and water infrastructure, because there may be some eel screens that need to be installed on infrastructure because, like one eel that every 10 years might die. And, but it sounds flippant, but when you set cultural targets like net zero 2050, these are the perverse outcomes you get. It's bad. It's not about decarbonising. It's about bad legislation, therefore breeding more bad legislation. So the concept of repealing that does not mean that the Conservatives should be completely anti-renewable energy. I don't think Claire is. I certainly don't think Kemi is. It's just repealing bad legislation that is leading to more bad policy.
Thanks. Jack, obviously we talk a lot about planning. We've talked a lot about planning and infrastructure in this Labour government over the last year and a half, and they've obviously brought forward quite a lot of changes to try to get more things built, including energy infrastructure. Do you think the government's planning, changes is enough to get the grid capacity that we need by 2030, by 2050?
And what would, Octopus like to see the government look at?
One of the arguments that we made for electricity market reform is that you'd be able to build less grid and still get the same output. £27 billion worth less grid, which obviously all goes on bills. What we're much more interested in is, rather than going always down the path of massive infrastructure, quite often very expensive massive infrastructure, so carbon capture or very large nuclear power stations. It's not an anti-nuclear point, it's more just don't want to pay over the nose for nuclear power, or very large offshore wind farms which then don't get switched on. We want to be able to produce and consume electricity in particular much more efficiently than we do. So there's always, like as the examples that Ben was just using was ridiculous, there is always going to be reforms in planning that we need to do. I do sometimes worry in energy debate in particular that we really over-index on the planning stuff. Not that it doesn't need to be done, but the other 5 things that I just mentioned, so taxes on consumption, burdensome regulation, dodgy prices, etc., are also just as important for getting not just the stuff built in the first place, but the right stuff built. We're very supportive of necessary planning reforms, but we want to see more done. I might just say though, so I advised Claire when she was Energy Secretary, and aside from the points around the Climate Change Act, which I fully get, but there were still other arguments for state intervention. So the Z mandate, that was brought forward by Boris Johnson, not as a green measure, but because he thought he could outcompete the Chinese on EVs, which they are very good at EVs. They do definitely make a lot. And this is the kind of the position that we're getting into, though, where we're almost like we're crossing the road and now we're starting to stand still in the middle of the motorway, where our petrol car auto industry is getting outcompeted by other countries, particularly China, because it's not just that they're subsidising their export, they're also just building quite good cars. And so they're kind of constantly asking the government to please just subsidise us a bit more, like petrol's going to remain in the future, but it will just get outcompeted and then it's going to collapse anyway. So I guess I would say realise that there are other benefits, energy security-wise or industrial base-wise, to certain policies that have been done under the banner of net zero, even if you're going to be trying to find a new replacement or alternative idea to the Climate Change Act.
Great, thank you guys. Thanks so much for really great opening remarks. Really appreciate it. Would love to open the floor. Oh, lovely, loads of questions. Do we have a roaming mic? Wonderful. Thank you very much. Can we start with this lady in the front, please? Could you just start by saying who you are, where you're from?
Sure, yes.
And who you'd like to address your question to?
Yes, thank you very much. So I've got 2 very quick ones, if it's all right. So my name is Caroline Bragg, I'm Chief Executive of the ADE, trade association representing energy companies. The first question, particularly to Dylan, but I guess to the panel overall, in terms of the Conservative change in policy. Alongside the CFD, the Tories also brought in the capacity market, which is a reflection that we don't have a merchant market for gas generation for power in this country too. It would be good to understand how you see that evolving as we move away from subsidies for power. The second thing I'd like to ask is, we've talked a lot about electricity on this panel so far, but this is a panel about energy. So when we look at the kind of Ukraine crisis, for example, heating bills shot up and we remain focused on gas primarily for our heating. In other countries where, for example, they use more of kind of waste heat, things like energy from waste, kind of stuff from the ground, etc., we didn't see the same shock actually in heating bills. And particularly to your point, Ben, in terms of, for example, data centres offer quite an opportunity to use more domestic heat in this country. So it'd be good just to touch a little bit more on the heat side as well as we can.
Ben, do you want to just kick off with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some really interesting technologies, not just in using waste heat for district heating schemes. There's some really interesting technology being developed using waste heat for production of hydrogen. So rather than using electricity, using heat, which again would potentially in certain clusters like Teesside would be a fantastic fuel source to go into the chemical and processing industry. Again, one of the problems we have going right back to the beginning is investment. And the whole hydrogen economy for the UK and the flagship project that Ed Miliband's still trying to push through is the blue hydrogen BP plant on Teesside, which the offtake was supposed to be SABIC, and SABIC have just pulled out of the UK because of the industrial market and energy pricing and the regulatory market, not just today, but the one they're forecasting coming down the line. So they've cancelled spending $400 million. They'd spent already, I think, nearly $300 million on the rebuild of that cracker to help INEOS invest $3 billion in Europe on a new cracker. So again, even from an investment point of view, sometimes it's not just about capital, it's about future projections around regulation. So I think there's some really interesting stuff there. There's some really interesting emerging technologies around using hydrogen storage in Teesside as well, using some of the old infrastructure that's there that could be really, really helpful. But the big thing for me as well is nuclear, and I think Dylan touched upon it. There's a fantastic project with Community Power, X-Energy and Centrica, all looking at building SMRs on Teesside. They don't want any subsidy. So again, we talk about costs. Actually, it's not costing us anything other than using cheap power that's not subsidised. Their big issue is they can't get any clarity out of government on the regulatory path for SMRs. And they've even said to government, even if you confirm that we have to go through the same regulatory framework as, say, Hinkley Point on big nuclear, at least we'll be able to move forward, but just tell us the rules of the game. So you've got regulatory uncertainty as well that doesn't help. And I also take your point on other areas not having the shock that we had. But also, the elephant in the room as well is that, there was a moratorium on fracking in the UK. And, one of the reasons that the Americans have been able to decarbonise significantly and become a net exporter is because of frack gas in the United Kingdom, in the US. And there are huge deposits in the north of England as well that we should be using to be able to go on to that journey. Abundance of energy, cheaper pathway, and then that will, again, assist the transition into other technologies once we're using that gas. So between nuclear and fracking, we've got a great answer to abundant technology, abundance in energy, new technology, and driving down costs. But this government's certainly not there, and it still seems to me that the Conservative Party isn't quite there yet anyway. So I appreciate I'm a bit of an outlier on that.
Dylan, can I just ask you to pick up on, and also just on Ukraine and whether international shocks, Ukraine, other energy markets are going to continue to have an impact on our gas prices, particularly for years to come, or are we nearly out of the woods on that?
Strongly echo frack baby frack. It's sort of disappointing to me that we haven't yet, at a bare minimum, squeezing every last drop out of the North Sea, and onshore ensures more revenue to the Treasury, and I think is not sort of bad for the climate in this getting that same oil and gas from Saudi Arabia is in fact worse for the climate than getting it from here. So why we're denying ourselves the jobs and the taxation revenue, I think is a very self-defeating point. How much would that actually bring down our gas prices? That is a matter of dispute. Some people say absolutely we can recreate a domestic market. Obviously, we're currently tied into European gas prices. That's why our prices spiked after Russia invaded Ukraine, even though we don't actually take that much Russian gas. But at a minimum, taxation revenue and jobs, and maybe cheaper prices. Very quick on nerdy point, but capacity market, very important. Also, the other bit of EMR. Government's principal job will always be in guaranteeing security of supply. Though I will say the other interesting thing about Texas is famously an energy-only market. In the REMA process, they've looked at other ways to deliver from capacity beyond the current CM, and obviously the government is working on CM reforms. So I dream of an energy-only market, but obviously that's a yet further away from where we are today.
Right, we've only got 11 minutes, and I really want to get to some more questions. So, to the lady there, thank you.
Hi, Sarah Houghton, Head of ADE Demand. So I think what's interesting is we keep talking about energy abundance, but the more we build, the more it costs. The more network we build, the more it costs. What's been a little less absent in this discussion is the role demand itself can play in bringing down energy prices. So there's huge potential from industrial, commercial and domestic flexibility. It's probably the quickest way to cut bills in the next decade. So what are people's views on that, as opposed to let's stop talking about the types of generation we're building and talk about how we can build less of it and still have an efficient system?
Dara, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think we did talk a bit about electrification and demand. I think there's an awful. I think one of the sort of failures of the Clean Power 2030 approach to date has been the focus on supply and not on demand. So I agree with your diagnosis there with the current government. But the reality is the demand bit is really hard, as the Conservative Party learnt in government. It's really difficult to ask people to think about whether they might want to change to having a heat pump. It's disruptive. It has an impact on control, choice, cost. You're entering someone's home. So the reality is we haven't done enough on that side of the house in general. We've talked a bit about EVs, but you can't build a market and you can't drive demand if you've not got the supply bit set up. And if you keep trying to push supply and you're not driving up demand, it's not going to work. It's basic economics. But the point around demand for me is that you have to play the long game. This has to go over the force of one parliament, because it takes a while to invest in supply chain. When David Cameron cut the green cap, that had a huge impact on the bills we were all paying at the height of the energy crisis. It's a long game. You have to think carefully. There's a couple of things that I think any government should be doing now and in the future, is really having a laser focus on how you actually support people through all of this. There's far too many bad news stories. There's far too many, for want of a better description, sort of cowboy tradespeople, and there's not enough kind of assurity and customer protection. You hear too many stories of somebody who's got somebody in to do something energy related to their home and it's led to mould or damp or something broken. We don't have a good enough baseline on how we help and support people to make these quite significant and expensive changes to their homes. So for me, that's an easy win for the government, but it's never been one any government's grasped.
Jack, as a former special advisor, what do you think that government should or could be doing to back to your question on demand? And is it something that's actually possible? As a journalist, we get it a lot. You ask politicians, should everyone just put on a jumper, or should we all just turn down our boilers? And there is such an anti-nanny state in politics of not wanting to tell consumers what to do, what cars to buy. How can the government play that role effectively, do you think, and the Conservative Party too?
You basically just need to make it attractive. So we've launched a new product. It's an EV. We can guarantee free charging if you just plug it in 20 times a month. We've got our zero bills homes, which we're now building 100,000 by 2030. That's basically demand flex. It's most simple, and we guarantee zero energy bills for 10 years. Behind the scenes, it's basically just shifting power to be optimize its load. We've done that for nuclear power plants. We've done that since the dawn of electricity, essentially. So there's no reason, especially now that we've got things like we've got Kraken, there's other AI instruments to basically optimize that load. There's no reason why we can't do that. And the fundamental question is, as a consumer, as long as there's good safeguards for vulnerable people, but as a consumer, would you rather your supplier pays you to either charge up your battery or your EV, or delay your washing machine by half an hour or bring it forward half an hour, and you get the cash? Or would you rather that everyone's bills go up because we need to urgently smash up a gas power plant at last minute rates because they managed to game the wind, basically? So we're at Oxford. I mean, we're definitely proving that people want to do this. A lot of our customers are really involved in our free electricity sessions, for example. It's, again, you have to have customers who want to do it, but at the moment, especially the levies, actually, they are preventing what is essentially the demand side of electricity from competing with the supply side. And I think once we unlock that, you completely change the game in how you're consuming electricity, and it becomes a lot easier to start basically soaking up the cheapest electrons whenever they're available on the grid. That's what flexibility is about. That's the real thing that can, I think, drastically improve the UK's energy position compared to what it's on now.
Making it easier to do. Questions to the gentleman there?
Thank you. Guy Senior from Battersea, Conservative Party member, not a public affairs person, and an Octopus customer. But could I ask, is one of the problems with the electricity costs because the price of wholesale electricity seems to me, and I may be wrong on this, to be dictated by the cost of gas, which is a relatively expensive way of generating electricity, rather than other means such as the solar panels that are currently hard at work on my roof?
Thank you. Dara, do you want to start with that one? Or Dylan? It
is. Gas sets the price. And the theory is the more renewables you have, the less often gas sets the price. So decoupling the electricity.
Governments have said that they're going to do this for such a long time, haven't they?
They have.
Why have not they done this?
I don't know. No, they have. They have talked about it a lot. I'll finish and then maybe we can hand to you. They have. I think that you're trying to balance an awful lot here. We've talked a lot about CFDs, but the reality is there is a really high cost of capital to build renewables, and then they're actually got really low running costs, whereas with gas, you build power plant and then you're constantly buying fuel. So they just are very just different technologies, and they have different economic drivers. So yes, we have talked about it a lot. If you were playing the long game, you could say actually the more renewables you have on the system, the less often gas will set the price. I think that there's probably something more radical we could do to decouple the prices, and I think we have to look carefully at the capacity market and the balancing mechanism to make sure that we do it. And that would be my answer.
Dylan, why haven't we done it? Should we do it?
Successive governments have been trying, and I mean, so this is the raging debate within energy policy that Catherine was keen to put her 2 cents in, and yeah, so that is exactly what Ed Miliband will say. Gas was the cause of the 22 crisis. We need to get off gas. Gas sets the price for all of our electricity. The whole point of a CFD is you fix at whatever price the CFD is at, and thus you're sort of you're not decoupling in the wholesale market, but the net effect is that you do indeed decouple, right? In the 22 crisis, the Truss government tried to sort of, radically, what can we do to decouple? And it didn't work. Didn't really work, no. But the trouble with that is, as I was alluding to, is that sort of narrative works if gas is in fact expensive, right? And in 2022, it absolutely was. That, of course, was the cause of our bill spikes and so on. On the flip side, what goes up can also go down. Let's talk about the roller coaster of fossil fuel markets. That is absolutely true. As it so happens, most people expect gas prices to decrease substantially in the next couple of years. So, that walking yourself and decoupling from gas prices works well if gas is expensive. If gas is not expensive, it works somewhat less well.
Can I guess? I think what Catherine was going to say was that it sets the wholesale price, which is about a third of the bill. And the problem is at the moment is gas is coming down. I mean, the reason I back electrification is because it's not just gas markets are now driven by politics more than economics. In a few years, we could have presidential candidate J.D. Vance going, actually, I'm quite sick of raising American gas prices by exporting it all as LNG. I'm going to shut off, do the American first thing and shut off LNG exports. You probably won't, but that would then rise our prices. Or maybe Qatar starts to sell much more to India, which is 10 times closer in nautical miles, as it overtakes our gas consumption. So we get pushed off the market, just like we did to Pakistan, which has now led to a rooftop solar revolution in Pakistan. But yeah, you've got the wholesale comprising about a third of the bill. It's not the gas price exactly, it's kind of also like gas capacity factors for their power plants, but the inflationary pressures over the next few years in particular that I'm worried about is more massively expensive network spend, overpaying for nukes, overpaying for renewable capacity, lack of flexibility, policy levies going through the roof as we kind of shove more stuff onto this kind of weird shadow tax system that we've got developing on energy bills. So yeah, we remain exposed, and that's really bad for our fiscal position. I've made the point to the Treasury that, I mean, the 40 to 50 billion pounds that we spent on energy price support, that's the same as an annual defence budget. And we could basically be paying for that, again, at a drop of a hat. So we're fiscally exposed while we're still that hooked on gas, but it is other cost inflationary pressures in the bill as well, which we need to drive down ruthlessly.
Thank you. Final question. Sir.
Hi, Malcolm Dunn, Ordinary Party member from the Cotswolds. Came to this to educate myself, and thank you to the panel. It has been an education. Also wanted to look at it from a political standpoint and look at our policy and how it compares to the other party. The panel have given Ed Miliband a bit of a kicking. I wondered what they thought of the reforms in energy policy as far as it goes. We haven't mentioned that
so far, have we? Ben, do you want to start with that?
I think they are reacting quite heavily to the current political sentiment, which they're largely fostering. I think it's also difficult to scratch below the surface on the reform policy because, and again, somebody else in the panel might know this better than I, but they talk about ripping up, obviously, a lot of the CFDs and the subsidies for renewables. Does that mean they're not going to do it going forward? Are they going to retrospectively tear up existing 20, 30-year contracts with the UK government, which has a huge issue as well of confidence from international markets investing in the UK. In the same way that if a government was to rip up any sort of legal contract, one of the founding principles of why we are such a good place to invest and we're so safe for international investment is we don't do the things that other maybe more less democratic countries might do. So I've got real concerns with that. And again, I go back to the fundamental point, which, again, I think why the American system is more misunderstood, is reform kind of going very anti-renewables. I think what you've heard, certainly from me and probably from everybody else in the panel, it's not about being anti-renewables, it's about being pro-energy in the right places, in the right regulation, using the balance of demand and supply. There is an existence everywhere for solar, onshore wind, nuclear, and gas, by the way. So even the most left-wing zealots on net zero, if they read the IPCC reports on 2050, you still need a lot of gas in 2050, never mind 2030 and 2035. So for us, it's about moving away from what I think is bad legislation and these headlines around pro or anti-net zero and look at what creates an effective energy market. And Reform haven't done that. They've played to the crowd, they've got a snappy headline, and they haven't got below the surface on how the answer is much more nuanced.
Anybody else to pick up finally as we wrap up very quickly on Reform's energy policy? Anyone?
Yeah.
Go on, Jack.
It was quite funny. They wrote to us going, "Don't you go into that CFD round?" But we never have been into one. So I let them know, and they were like, "Oh, sorry."
Okay, so just very quickly though, it's a praise Octopus and Jack, and I would say that because Greg, the founder, is from Teesside. But
No bias here.
he briefly touched upon it. But this pilot that they're running on homes, where basically they're guaranteeing zero energy prices for homeowners on these houses for 10 years because of the way they can use existing technology, arbitrage, balance the grid on supply and demand. Why would Reform be against that, right? Free energy for households, even though it's renewable, why would you care? And that's the point, there's a lack of nuance in their argument when there are real-life working examples out there in the market that show that it works.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to a wonderful panel. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Dara. Thank you, Dylan. Have a great rest of your conference, and thank you so much for coming. Thanks, CBS.